Hello everyone, I'm Frances Cleaver and I'm going to tell you a story that centres around rice and what rice can tell us about how people in rural Tanzania manage their resources. So it's 1999 and I'm on a bus travelling to the Usangu Plains in South West Tanzania. The plains are renowned for being a fertile area for growing rice, and a lot of people want to go and live there for that purpose. The journey is long, about 800 kilometres, and we stop once for lunch at a roadside cafe. It's here that I taste my first rice from the Usangu Plains. And while I'm sitting in the cafe, surrounded by other bus passengers, we're eating our plates heaped with rice and beans, and the other bus passengers are telling me with great enthusiasm about all the varieties of rice that grow in the plains, the different textures, smells, tastes. They even tell me about a variety of rice that's so fragrant and exquisite, it's only used for bedroom purposes when a woman wants to seduce a man. Well, I only have a passing interest in the rice at this stage, but not realising how important it will become to my research and also how many plates of rice and beans I'll eat over the next few decades. Okay, so I'm travelling to the Usangu Plains as part of a large team funded by British Development Aid, and our task, we're going to the Usangu Plains because there's a bit of a national environmental panic. The rivers that run through the plains feed the Great Ruaha River, and the Great Ruaha River has started to dry up. And because it's drying up, the national park that's downstream is really suffering. The animals there are dying, and the tourists don't want to go on safari because they don't want to go and see hippos dying. Further downstream, the low river flows mean that the hydroelectric plants can't generate electricity, and therefore the lights in Tanzanian cities are going out, and the politicians are really feeling the pressure. People are very dissatisfied. So I'm part of this large British development team that's going to the Usangu Plains to try and find ways of making sure that the resources are managed better so that flows of water run into the rivers and the river flows right through the plains, down through the park and through the hydroelectric power plants. And my part of this job is to try and understand how people in the plains manage their resources and also how they come together collectively in community-managed institutions to manage resources like land and water. So as part of this project, we're going to establish community-based institutions like farmer organisations, pastoralist associations, forest committees. And the idea is that if we can get people themselves managing resources, we'll create efficiencies in the actual resource management, but also everyone will be able to access the resources they need for a livelihood. Okay. But when I started this work in 1999, I thought I would be there for the duration of the project, which was 2 or 3 years. But here I am, 20 years later, still working on the same issues. And what I've learned over the years is that development projects, and particularly community management, rarely works out as the planners intended. And that's because the social logics and social relationships of the people doing this community management is very different from the logics of the planners who planned it. So let's have a look at this by seeing how one of these community-based organisations works out over time. And I'm going to talk about an irrigators association that is an organisation of farmers who all grow irrigated rice, and their job is to manage some of the water flows and to ensure that everyone can grow rice. Okay, so to start with, let's consider the case of Mrs. M, a rice farmer who becomes a member of an irrigators association. When I first met Mrs. M in 1999, she was the second wife of quite a prominent man in the village. He was a traditional healer and he was quite well off. He had 12 acres of irrigated rice. but I only got to meet him and the senior wife. Mrs. M was the junior wife, and she was busy labouring on the rice fields at the time. When I went to the same household 10 years later, Mrs. M's fortunes had changed. The husband and the first wife had died, and Mrs. M, the second wife, had inherited these 12 acres of rice. But she had trouble making that inheritance real because the relatives of the dead husband wanted to claim those fields for themselves. So Mrs. M went to the local court, took a case out, and got a court ruling that the fields should be hers. So that's great. Then she has a means of a livelihood. She'll be a member of the Irrigators Association, and she should be able to make a good living. However, the men of the village and the ones who run the Irrigators Association don't like this situation, and so they actually make it very difficult for her to get water. They withhold water from her rice fields, so she's unable to cultivate. Eventually, being unable to cultivate, she has no choice but to rent out the fields to those very same people, probably on the Irrigators Association, and move to another village where she opens a small grocery store. Unfortunately, the withholding of water by the Irrigators Association sets Mrs. M off on a downward spiral, really, from which she never recovers. And when I meet her just recently, she's had to, over the years, sell all those acres of rice to meet her living costs, healthcare costs, and so on. And now she's just cooking buns to sell by the roadside to make a very poor living. She still does, however, aspire to be a rice farmer, and she's hoping to be able to rent another field to grow rice. So what Mrs. M's case shows us, I think, is that we can't assume that local institutions, the Irrigators Association in this case, benefits everybody or represents everybody, and that such institutions are deeply embedded in unequal social relations and power structures. But let's have a look in more detail at how this Irrigators Association worked over time. Remember, this was an organisation that we actually set up as part of the development project in 1999, thinking we were enhancing community-based management. And over the decades since 1999, the Irrigators Association has gone from strength to strength. It's become a highly commercialised, seemingly successful organisation. With loans and grants from international donors, they've been able to build a huge warehouse for storing their rice. They've built up a whole arsenal of power equipment, harvesters and tractors and tillers. And they've been able to improve the infrastructure, the canals and gates, which regulate flows in and out of the irrigation scheme. They've grown so much, in fact, that they've professionalised. They've had to employ a professional manager because it's no longer enough to expect people to voluntarily manage this organisation. The professional manager is called Joe, and he's a young man, and he's actually the son of a farming family from the area. He went away to agricultural university. Now he's come back to manage the Irrigators Association. But he finds the job really, really challenging. And one of the reasons that it's so challenging is because he's trying to manage farmers who are his brothers and uncles and father and so on, and trying to organise them. He has particularly difficulty in getting the farmers to pay fees and subscriptions that enable the work of the association. So when we visited the area just earlier this year, we found Joe running around trying to resolve just such a problem. The Irrigators Association owed 3.5 million Tanzanian shillings to the River Basin Authority. Now, that's not actually a huge amount of money. It's equivalent to about 25 sacks of rice. But they had been in arrears for a long time, and the money was owed for their water permit, their right to take water for irrigation from the river. So because they were in arrears, they were threatened, if they didn't pay within 2 days, they'd have their access to river water cut off. So the farmers were still reluctant to pay, the individuals. So Joe, the manager, had to run round to the village money lenders to borrow money from them. The moneylenders are the bigger, richer farmers. So Joe runs and borrows money from the big farmers, goes to pay the debt at the River Basin Authority, and the idea is that after the next harvest, when all the farmers are feeling like a lot of well-being from their harvest, that they will pay back the debt in rice at 100% interest. So that's just to say that the apparently successful Irrigators Association is itself still dependent on social relations and on unequal social relations, and particularly on powerful individuals in the community. So, but power isn't everything, if you like. And one thing I've also learnt over the years is that people's cultural understandings also affect the way that they make their livelihoods and that resources are done. So a year ago, I was just leaving the plains at the end of a research trip, and I'm in the Land Rover with the research team, and the Land Rover's really struggling hard to go up the hill that goes out of the plains. And the reason it's struggling is because the Land Rover's absolutely full of sacks of rice. It's been a bumper harvest, and all my Tanzanian research colleagues have bought sacks of rice to take back to their families in town. The whole car smells of this very vegetal smell of fresh rice. Okay. Now then, I'm not one to ever lose an hour on a research trip, so I'm making the most of this last bit of the journey to quiz one of my colleagues who's also himself a rice farmer. And I'm interested in partly about the sort of household economy of rice. So I ask my colleague whether he uses fertiliser on his rice fields. And he says, I use a little bit, but not very much. Partly because it's expensive, and partly because the elders tell us not to. They tell us that fertiliser is so strong, it destroys the fertility of the soil. So I say, oh, that's interesting. But if that's the case, why do you use any at all? You say you use a small amount of fertiliser. And he says, well, fertiliser is such a strong thing that we use a little bit on each of the four corners of the field, north, south, east and west, to protect our crops against witchcraft. So, as we're further leaving the plains, I reflect on this 20-year history of working in the area and think that development projects can't succeed unless they take account of power relations in the village, social relations and the way people relate to each other, and also people's cultural understandings of the world. And indeed, as we cross a bridge over one of the rivers, the tributaries of the Great Ruaha, as we're leaving, I notice that the water levels are very low, and the 20-year problem of restoring flows into the Great Ruaha River still hasn't been resolved. There's a short postscript to this story. After 4 or 5 hours in the rice-smelling car, we reach the regional town, and I suggest we have a final celebratory meal before we go our separate ways. Now, we've been in the field for a long time, and we have eaten rice and beans every day, sometimes twice a day. So on the journey, my thoughts are turning to steak and chips, grilled fish, salad, all the things that are possible in town. But then one of my colleagues pipes up and he says, I know a great place to eat. It's by the bus station. It's down that little alley. They make the best rice and beans you've ever tasted. Thank you.